Attack on Titan, the show that made me an anime fan, is over. I know I'm late, but I had to make a video about it. I still remember the day when I, bored out of my mind, decided to check out this critically acclaimed title. It was one of the best decisions I had ever made. The early parts of the show were well equipped to hook people like me in. Some consider the first season to be generic, but to me, it was completely unique, as I had never seen an anime prior to it. It was fascinating. The sheer scale, the stakes, the unforgiving nature of storytelling, it was out of this world. The show was meticulously crafted. Everything made sense. Isayama took every aspect into consideration and crafted one of the most airtight, complex, and well thought out stories ever. He wasn't afraid to take risks. He boldly switched up the main genres and themes on multiple occasions. This constant evolution of the story is the reason why it has maintained its popularity for so many years. The fourth season was the boldest. It wasn't afraid to take that extra step. It wasn't afraid to mix the black and white and make the story more grey than ever before. I can go on and on about this season or this show as a whole, but let's skip through some of that and have a discussion about the ending. Make sure to subscribe. Now, Attack on Titan has always been a compact show. It answered most of the questions it raised, but the ending was uncharacteristically vague. A lot of it was left up to interpretation. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It gives us something to think about for years to come. Regardless, this is my interpretation of the ending. Let's go through it chronologically. The Alliance is fighting what appears to be a losing battle against Eren and Ymir, and Armin is having a conversation with Zeke in the paths. After a short, somewhat rushed exchange of words, Zeke understands the value of the mundane, the small things that don't play a role in multiplication but are priceless regardless. Zeke still believed in his original plan, but acknowledged Armin's point of view, partially because it was too late to set the euthanasia plan into motion anyway. Of course, Zeke's character deserves a ton of thought and interpretation, but we'll focus more on the last chapter. Zeke and Armin manage to convince some of the deceased shifters to take their side, and this is where a main theme of this show comes in. Whenever you think of the term symbolism in conjunction with AOT, the first thing that comes to mind is that godforsaken bird. But there's another piece of symbolism that's equally as important: the forest. The forest is the cycle. It's the atrocities committed by both sides and the resulting ill feelings. It's the world that the next generation is born into, making them the children of the forest. Armin and Zeke convincing the shifters, the same shifters who had been at each other's throats for generations, using their words, was therefore significant. We'll return to the forest in a bit. The fight continues. Eren is defeated, but he comes back. How? I'm not quite sure. I always thought of the Attack Titan's power as an unpredictable one. In an attempt to move forward, it bends the rules. That's the same explanation I used to justify Eren's unique form near the end of Season 1. Overall, this is an aspect left to interpretation, and it's relatively insignificant. Once the fight ends, the most controversial section of this story begins. Let's go through each individual aspect of the final chapter, starting with Ymir, and by extension, Mikasa. Ymir as a character is difficult to comprehend. The fact that she doesn't speak isn't helpful either. Having been oppressed all her life by the evil king, she should have nothing but fear and scorn for him, and yet Eren says she loved him. That doesn't make sense, right? Actually, it does. Eren's words here are a bit misleading. The way I see it, this love wasn't necessarily a romantic one. It was more of a warped sense of affection she developed in response to her circumstances. Ymir had her whole identity taken away from her. She was a slave, someone with no dignity or free will. Being a child, she didn't have a grandiose goal. All she wanted was human connections, people who would need her, people who would love her. When she gained her Titan powers, the king did need her, for all the wrong reasons, and her innocent yet warped mind perceived that need as a connection. And in that way, she loved the king, as the king was the only one who, as bad as this sounds, used used her. Her protecting the king is an action that can be traced back to this quote-unquote love. During her final moments, she perhaps expected more attention from the king. She saved his life after all, and yet the king dismissed her in his usual manner, which caused her to lose her will to live. And when that happens, Titan regeneration stops working, which is why she passed away. It made her feel as helpless and alone as the day she was chased by the king's men. Thus the reused shot of the flower. Even after death, she sought connections, which led to the formation of the paths, which literally connects all Eldians. She made the decision to protect the king out of her own will, and after receiving no appreciation for it, she went back to being obedient. The amalgamation of love and obedience in her heart became a shackle that bound her for 2000 years. I recommend watching this video for a more in-depth look at Ymir. 2000 years later, Eren freed her. Or did he? If she was free, aka her desire for human connection was fulfilled, why would the paths still exist? In reality, Eren didn't set her free at this moment. He simply set a sequence of events into motion which would eventually free her. He allowed Ymir to make her own decisions, all while asking for her help. The way I see it, Ymir didn't really care about the rumbling itself. Eren treating her like a person and asking her for help is what moved her. But as Eren allowed her to make her own decisions, she started observing her surroundings, the victims of the rumbling, Armin's point of view, and most importantly, Mikasa's life and her final decision. The concept of time doesn't exist in the paths, so Ymir, after observing Mikasa's decision to end Eren, went back and observed her whole life, which is the reason behind her headaches. Zeke clearly stated that the headaches are not an Ackerman-only thing. There aren't that many similarities between Mikasa and Ymir, and yet it was Mikasa that freed Ymir. That doesn't make sense, right? Actually, it does. Both Mikasa and Ymir faced a tragedy at a young age, which led to their families dying and them finding a new home, one of which was far nicer. But the similarities end there. Ymir rarely made a decision on her own. As such, the idea of using her power to free herself never occurred to her. Eren allowed her to make her own decisions. Armin indirectly told her about the value of small, mundane things, a concept which must have been alien to her at that point. And finally, Mikasa showed her a visual example of someone using their power to make their own decision. This way, the main trio had a massive amount of influence over Ymir. As for Mikasa, she knew Eren was a violent fellow, but when that violence turned into genocide, she had to make a choice. And it took her a while. She spent most of the 4th season making that decision. In fact, it was the cabin memories which finally helped her decide. So what was the cabin scene? Obviously, it's an alternate version of events, but did it actually occur? Is it an alternate timeline? Well, it, like a lot of things, is left to interpretation. Alternate timelines don't exist in AOT because of reasons I'll get into later. And yet, this is very clearly an alternate reality where Mikasa gave Eren a different answer. I don't think it's a fabricated memory either, because Ackerman minds cannot be manipulated. So the only logical explanation is that this is an alternate version of events, right? Well, the way I see it, this was a false memory, a simulation. It's not something that really happened, but rather something that could have. The founder cannot manipulate the memories of an Ackerman, but it can add information. Eren conversed with Levi and Mikasa via the paths back in part 2. I think these memories are a what could have been version of events. The actual events were still there in Mikasa's mind. This version was simply added on top of it. Again, the exact mechanism behind it is very vague. So, who sent these memories to her? It could have been Eren. He shared these memories but could not erase them due to her Ackerman powers. Or it could have been Ymir, since she had been peering into Mikasa's head for a while, and she had that same headache prior to the vision. Mikasa helped Ymir make her decision, and Ymir helped Mikasa make hers. Sounds poetic. Anyway, these memories helped Mikasa make up her mind. She realized that even if she had given a different answer that day, genocide would still occur, and her friends would still die. Also, she realized that she had to face the situation in front of her. Instead of wondering what could have been, she needed to do what needed to be done. She would not forget Eren. She could not. Instead, she would face him and put an end to his actions herself. And with that, Eren's life came to an end. Ymir finally realized that the king used her and didn't have a shred of affection for her. This was only possible because Eren allowed her to think and Mikasa gave her that final push she needed. Ymir realized that the decision she made that day 2000 years ago was the wrong one, as shown by this shot. Just like Mikasa's memories, this was something that could have been. Ymir realized that her relationship with the king wasn't really a connection. It was a one-sided exploitation. As such, her love for the king was gone. At the same time, she realized that her bond with her children was the real connection she sought. She was no longer bound by the king's orders or her feelings towards him, and she was no longer searching for human connection, which led to the disappearance of Titan powers and the paths respectively. And that concludes one aspect of this incredibly complex ending. On to the next one. Eren eradicated 80% of humanity and the Alliance became heroes to the remaining 20. But obviously that alone isn't enough to stop the cycle. And this is where the forest comes in. The forest is that cycle, and Armin's way of dealing with it is very different from that of Eren. While Armin looked for a way to escape the forest, aka have people understand each other, Eren crushed the forest itself. There can be no racism if every race besides one is annihilated. We'll talk more about Eren in a second. The world, of course, isn't that ideal. War would start up again. Armin's solution was ideal, but at the same time, it was impossible to achieve. And Eren's actions made it even more difficult. He crippled part of humanity, and things would go back to normal once they recovered. True peace can never be achieved, but there is hope. In a collective effort to recover from the scars left by the rumbling, people would make changes to themselves and to society itself. The fact that Paradis survived for centuries despite not having Titan powers is proof of that. War will always exist, but the severity and the frequency of the same would perhaps be less. Again, it is ambiguous, but people, Armin in particular, would continue working towards this hopeful goal. Armin will continue to prove the fact that Eldians are humans. He does so near the end of the final episode, a direct parallel to his actions back in season 1. This idea adds a sinister undertone to this otherwise hopeful scene. The kids are literally planting the forest, which would one day grow, both literally and metaphorically. But there will always be hope, as proven by this kid. A semi-direct parallel to Ymir, we can spot the differences between her and this kid. Ymir was injured, chased by dogs, and driven towards the tree out of desperation, while this kid isn't injured, has a dog as a pet, and enters the tree out of curiosity. What will this event lead to? Isayama lets us decide. That is the world of Attack on Titan. It's painfully realistic. And that brings us to the final and the most complicated aspect of the ending, Eren himself. And it's genuinely confusing. At first, Eren talks about his friends becoming heroes, but that's obviously not the reason why he activated the rumbling. It's just a fortunate byproduct of the same. To understand Eren, we need to go back. The word freedom is inseparable from Eren. His character underwent a ton of development, but freedom was always a driving force for him. However, what Eren truly wanted was his own twisted version of freedom and not freedom itself. The difference between Armin and Eren was established early on. While Armin focused on the landscapes outside the walls, Eren focused on the Titan killing required to reach those landscapes. Even when they reached the ocean at the end of the 3rd season, Armin and Eren's reactions were completely different. In a way, Armin is more of a scout than Eren. Contrary to popular belief, the main purpose of the scouts isn't to kill Titans, it's to help humanity reach the other side of the walls. They are called the Survey Corps, not the Titan Hunters. Their symbol is a wing, not a weapon. Just in case any of you wondered which side Erwin would be on, there's your answer. Let's clear up a few misconceptions here. Eren did not activate the rumbling because he had no other choice. As pointed out by Armin, he did have other choices, a partial activation being one of them. He activated the rumbling because he wanted to. Proof? Eren's own words. Ramsey didn't understand Eren's language, so he had no reason to lie here. Another aspect that needs clarification is Eren's intentions prior to the activation of the rumbling. The Attack Titan's ability allows future inheritors to send memories back to past shifters. It doesn't allow them to see the future itself. Future Eren sent memories back to past Grisha. These memories included the sights of the rumbling, Ramsey, and the words Eren spoke in that cave. As such, these these are the only memories pre-rumbling Eren had access to. Eren did not know that he would be stopped at this point, since Grisha did not know. When Eren activated the rumbling, he had every intention of slaughtering everybody outside the walls. It was after the activation of the rumbling that he knew he would be stopped. We need to make another thing clear at this point, and this ties into something I said previously. The concept of multiple timelines doesn't exist in AOT. The show itself has hinted at that fact time and time again. Grisha knowing what the future is, but letting Eren inherit the Attack Titan anyway. Eren's words about the genocide already being determined, and the fact that it always ended the same way. The future exists because the past has led to it. Everything that happens, including Eren having access to the memories of the future, is a building block that leads to the future. It's Eren's own twisted desire and nature that led to the rumbling. He wanted this. He wanted to wipe it all away. He wanted to flatten the world. And at the same time, he wanted to protect his friends. After Eren acquired Ymir's power and activated the rumbling, he gained complete access to both the past and the future, but the end result was already determined. Eren didn't plan on slaughtering 80% of humanity. That's just the point at which he was stopped. It could have just as easily been 81%. Eren's plan was to wipe out every single person outside the walls, and he was stopped before he could. Of course, Eren didn't want his friends to die, but his actions did lead to some of them dying, namely Sasha and Hanji, as well as Floch and his squad, something Eren acknowledges near the end. If Eren truly wanted to be stopped, and he had the ability to enforce that, these people would still be alive. Yes, Eren didn't take away their Titan powers, but that's possibly because he knew that they would try to stop him regardless, and without their Titan powers, more of them would die. So, just to reiterate, Eren's own warped desire for freedom led to the activation of the rumbling. It wasn't a last resort, it was something Eren wished for. Due to the one timeline rule, the rumbling would be stopped and 80% of humanity would die. That's simply the way things play out. It's decided. It has always been decided. Not by Eren, but rather by a complex equation of each character, their natures and their actions. Grisha killed the Reyes family because he saw those memories, but at the same time, he saw those memories because he killed the Reyes family. The past, present and future has already been determined, and not even the founding Titan can change it. That's why Eren sent Dinah towards his mom. Birth control doesn't die here, Carla does, and that has already been determined. And the same goes for Eren's participation in that event. That cannot be changed. Eren's obsession with his version of freedom is the cause, and Eren's actions are the effect. Thus the all-important line, "I'm a slave to freedom." Eren's desire for freedom is what set the whole thing into motion. His nature is what led to the rumbling, and after acquiring the Founder's power, Eren realized just how helpless he was against his own nature and desire. Seeing both the future and the past but still continuing to follow the same sequence of events, it sounds like a curse. In that way, Eren was the least free of them all, playing along with the same series of events, not because he had no other choice, but because he wanted to. To quote Kenny, everybody is a slave to something, and for Eren that something was freedom. So why did Eren's desire for freedom lead to such a drastic event, you may ask? Well, because he's a f***ing idiot, an absolute moron whose nature was rooted in extremism. Wipe them out, kill them all. Eren always went back to those phrases, and when he obtained power, he did just that. He attempted to wipe them out, the them being everyone. And that pretty much sums up Eren's conclusion. I won't spend time talking about Eren breaking down. If you have followed him since the start, you know that this makes complete sense. Eren was never that stoic. His friends always meant a lot to him. That's just who he is. A kid hopelessly chained to his own nature and violent desire for freedom. And that was Attack on Titan's ending. I think it's brilliant, and I tried my best to explain why. At the end of the day, a lot of it was my interpretation. You can interpret it differently, and or you can think differently of it. It's all subjective at the end of the day. Attack on Titan, to me, is special. It's the show that made me an anime fan, and I will continue to think about it for years, if not decades. It's one of those shows which stays with you. A heartfelt thank you goes out to Hajime Isayama, the staff at Studio Wit, and MAPPA, Hiroyuki Sawano, Kota Yamamoto, and everyone else involved with this series. Thank you all so much for creating something special. That's about it. Did you like this video? Check out this other bit of content on screen if you did. Make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time.